Hey, AP World History coming at you with another great lecture. This time we're hitting one of world history enthusiasts' all time favorite places and times. We're going to be taking a look at feudal Japan, that of samurai fame and headhunters and death and destruction and all the things that make AP World History awesome. So buckle up. We got a lot of dynamic history ahead for you guys as we check out the evolution of Japan. Now, in terms of our objectives for this particular presentation, we want to check out and determine what the shogunate system was in Japan, be able to describe how it worked. We want to look at the process for reunification of Japan and explain how that occurred. We want to discuss Japanese interactions with Europeans. This is the time of European expansion and exploration. We want to describe life in Japan under the Tokugawa Shogunate in particular. And then lastly, we're going to start to open a discussion on the comparison between Chinese and Japanese policies towards Europeans and European traders. So take a second, fire these objectives down, organize your notes around these big ideas. Our AP themes will include governance, economics, in this case, trade, and then social and cultural organization and patterns. Now, in terms of some of the background history of Japan that you're going to need to make sense of this presentation and lecture, let's go back a little bit further than the period of unification to look at what Japan was going through starting right around the year 1000 CE. At this point in time, we see Japan start to move towards a much more organized system of dividing power from the emperor on down. Now, when I say organized, I mean there's a term for like stratification, very similar to the feudal system that was in place in Europe right around this same time. The Japanese emperor was a figurehead, though. He didn't have a lot of actual real power. Most of the power fell to the shoguns, and those shoguns would be rivals towards one another and would continuously vie for supremacy of larger and larger realms or territories. By the end of the 1400s, the centralized governmental system of one singular shogunate under ostensible control of the emperor, but really operating autonomously, started to fall apart. And this occurred because many of the daimyos, who would be the next group of leaders underneath these shoguns, started to gain more power. These daimyos started to battle amongst themselves in the period called the Sengoku period, which led to all-out warfare inside of Japan and created large amounts of chaos. This period of warfare will last for almost 200 years. If we were to take a look at the organizational pattern or system that I just described, we would have the emperor up on top, followed by the shoguns, who are the level 2 leaders. They are subdividing their power down to the daimyo, and then we arrive on the samurai. The samurai are the warrior class. Think about European knights, but maybe with a little bit more honor, but also with maybe a little bit more brutality. The samurai are going to battle one another and keep control of the realm of the daimyo, very similar again to what we saw in feudal Europe, with vassals keeping control over various manors inside of the feudal realm. The people living inside of that feudal realm are going to be peasants and artisans. These people will have slightly more power in Japan than the merchant class. The merchant class is the lowest of the classes in feudal Japan because they were viewed as producing nothing for society. A farmer produces food, an artisan produces tools or weapons or various accoutrements to life that make life better. But a merchant is only out for themselves. They are looking to make money and self and betterment, which would be seen as antithetical to society. If that sounds familiar to you and you're thinking like, hey, that's kind of similar to what we've been seeing in dynastic China, ding, 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 that is correct. Why so? Because Japan during the Edo period imported much of China's culture because they thought it was a perfect example of cultural stratification and the highest achievement of humanity. And so the Japanese sought to pattern their civilization after the Chinese civilization, which is why we see at the lower levels of the social spectrum many of the same subdivisions. Now, if we were to take a look at a political map of Japan during the Sengoku period that we just described, the territories of the daimyo, which you would see in all these various colors, would be these somewhat independent realms, and these splotches of yellow are going to represent the lands that are under more centralized control. Remember, the shogun is the ostensible power. And so what we're going to start seeing starting in the 1500s and culminating in the 1600s is a drive to take all of the different colors, all the different realms of the daimyo that existed prior to the Tokugawa Shogunate, and bring them all together under one central unified power system, one shogunate. That, though, would require much warfare and much chaos, which would eventually need to be halted and organization brought to the home islands of Japan. Japanese unification could be seen as a threefold process. The unification begins in the middle parts of the 1500s with Oda Nobunaga. His work will be continued by his retainer, a man named Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and then ultimately unification will be achieved under Tokugawa Ieyasu. Each one of these three men, though, Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, are each responsible for various stages of unification. And without any one of those three, it's unlikely that Japan would have become fully unified under one singular shogunate. So even though these men don't always have the same birth family, they're not part of the same daimyo system or house of one lord shogun, they do all bring forth different organizational patterns and start to tamp down some of the chaos of the Sengoku period, which eventually will allow for a more unified Japan. The first of these men is Oda Nobunaga. Now, Oda Nobunaga is an interesting character in Japanese history for a couple of different reasons. One, he was a brilliant military strategist. He's the first of the great unifiers because he is able to defeat many of the various daimyos throughout central Japan, utilizing up to this point really unconventional military tactics, not just all-out assaults. He's willing to ambush his enemies. He's also extremely brutal. During one of his campaigns, the Iko-Iki campaign, there's a battle at the Mount High where Nobunaga will seize control of a town. He will kill all the men. He will kill all the women. He will kill all the children that he can find. He will kill monks. He will display brutalized and mutilated bodies. He will earn the nickname at this battle of being the demon daimyo. And for more on him and his maniacal drive towards military success, make sure you check out Storytime with the Historist for a more in-depth look at the demon daimyo, or the devil king as he was known to his enemies. One of the ways that Nobunaga became more successful on the battlefield and was able to control more territory was because of his engagement with Europeans and European traders. Specifically, Nobunaga opened up a weapons trade with Dutch merchants. He was somewhat more skeptical of Portuguese merchants over time because the Portuguese merchants sought to import more Christianity, which Nobunaga started to see as a disruptive force. Of course, this will come to a head later on under Toyotomi Hideyoshi. However, both Dutch and Portuguese merchants bring with them military technology such as harquebusiers or hand cannons, like you see maybe like early versions of a pistol or a rifle, which revolutionized the Japanese battlefield. Now, Nobunaga was not the first or only daimyo to have access to weapons, but he did utilize them most effectively, and he was the most willing of the Japanese leaders to engage in trade. However, Oda Nobunaga meets somewhat of an inauspicious end. While seizing control and power in southern Japan, he is ambushed by one of his generals and he is forced to commit seppuku or harikiri, which is ritual suicide. It was that or be executed, so it's not like he had much of a choice. His retainer, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who is a lowly farmer from birth, who rose up through the ranks of the samurai to become a daimyo, and eventually the next shogun takes control and continues the wars of expansion that Oda Nobunaga had engaged in, and takes it one step further, as he will start to target Korea as a place of Japanese expansion and potentially start to look into an invasion of China, which has been much weaker, at least in the Japanese eyes, since the Yuan dynasty fell and the rise of the Ming. At the same time, though, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who's looking outward in terms of expansion, starts to become much more suspicious of Europeans and of European powers, specifically those Iberian powers like the Portuguese, who he views as being disruptive to traditional Edo-Japanese culture. Remember that high point of culture that had been imported from China. And the specific issue here surrounded Jesuit missionaries. Many of these missionaries had sought to convert native Japanese people, this being very similar to the conversion movement that we see in the Western Hemisphere by Spanish and Portuguese monks and priests who moved into native regions and attempted to convert Amerindians and other native peoples, due in large part to the Counter-Reformation goals of expanding Christianity. We see the same pattern playing itself out in Japan. However, when the Jesuits and other missionary groups like the Franciscans start to become a little bit more unruly, like destroying Zen Japanese shrines or disrupting cultural practices that had dated back hundreds of years in traditional Japanese culture, Hideyoshi began to prohibit Christian monks from converting people. This eventually comes to a head when all missionaries are expelled and a group of 26 martyrs, that is what the Christians will call them, the 26 martyrs, are taken and executed in a very brutal fashion. Their mutilated bodies are displayed for public consumption, not eating, viewing. And these people would be Japanese converts. They would be monks, Franciscan monks. They would range in ages from teenage to elderly, and they would be of both European and Japanese descent. But the message was clear. Europeans would not be tolerated. Europeans would not be allowed inside of the country any longer, and only a small presence of Europeans would be allowed to stay in southern Japan near the port of Nagasaki, and the traders who would be allowed to stay would be Dutch traders, not any of the Iberians who had up to this point been dominating the inroads and incursion into Japan. Now, Toyotomi Hideyoshi dies abruptly during his campaigns of expansion, specifically after the Second Korean campaign and the expulsion of the Europeans. And his abrupt death, along with these failed expansion campaigns and cutting off trade, which started to hurt the Japanese economy, created an opening inside of the power structure, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, the last of the three unifiers, takes control and creates what will become the Tokugawa Shogunate, which will be the longest lasting of the shogunate powers and won't be dissolved until 1883. It'll go into effect right around 1604. He becomes appointed shogun by the Council of Five, a high-powered group of daimyos and lords. He very quickly finishes the unification by driving on Edo, or what is modern-day Tokyo, and building a series of fortifications to keep out both rival daimyo, but also to keep out Europeans. He fortifies the ports, he fortifies the cities, so that if Europeans do come back, he will be ready to fight them. He will seek to bring about more of a pure form of Japanese culture. He will entrench himself back into the Edo culture, and his goal, and the goal of his shogunate after his death in 1617, will be to take Japanese culture and almost freeze it in time. This will provide more stability because of many of the dynamic changes that had preceded the Sengoku period were seen as the reason why civil war had broken out. And so if there is a more stable system for Japan, then there would be less civil war. One of the best examples of this isolation that occurs and this freezing in time that occurs during the Tokugawa Shogunate are the Tokugawa Laws of 1634, which will outrightly ban the trade and engagement of all Japanese merchants, daimyos, samurai with any outside European force. All trade must halt. Any trade ships that come into Japanese waters will be destroyed. And outside of that small trading presence of that had been established under Hideyoshi in Nagasaki, there will be no more trade interactions of any kind, except again for that Dutch interaction. And that probably owes to the fact that the Dutch had been much more religiously tolerant, owing to the way that the Dutch civilization had evolved in Europe, and not much more to any other reason. The Dutch were just seen as being less of a threat than the Iberian powers. Now, under Tokugawa rule, one of the things that needed to be established was more control and less chaos. And this means more organization of the daimyo. And this will occur by a strengthening of the feudal system, specifically the Bukan system, which subdivided the lands of the daimyo into smaller domains. Think about some of the ways that our gunpowder empires subdivided their lands to create more administrative control. And at the same time, two different houses were to be established for each one of the daimyo, one in Edo or Tokyo, the capital city, and one in the regional city. And this way, the families could be held hostage. And if any daimyo do decide to rise up and try to take power from the Tokugawa shogun, the family would be killed. This becomes a very effective mechanism for control. The Bukan system would then be employed by the daimyo over the samurai for the same reason. And then this way, we get stronger links of fealty between the shogun, daimyo, and samurai. The system of social stratification between the Sengoku period and the Tokugawa period becomes a lot more systematic as well. As you can see here, there becomes a new class, Ronin, these masterless samurais, and we also see a subdivision of the peasant and artisan classes into separate classes to create a little bit more social stratification, and the hope is more organization inside of society. In terms of the economic changes that are brought about by the Tokugawa shogunate, there is much more drive towards creating more internal Japanese industry, more growth in terms of agriculture. This owes in large part to the fact that the Japanese are not trading, right? We know that the Tokugawa laws are going to outlaw trading with the Europeans. Japan had war relations with Korea, which would mean that the Korea and Japanese will not be trading with one another. And we know from previous lectures that the Ming had closed themselves off pretty completely as well during this time. So Japan is not going to be trading with China, which means that Japan is going to need to self-strengthen. And during this time period, we see expansions in industry, in banking, in merchant class growth, specifically between northern and southern Japan, and an increase in tax collection as well, although these taxes would lead to more peasant revolts, but those peasant revolts were easier to put down because of the Bukan system and the oaths of fealty that the samurai had taken to the daimyo. The samurai would not use these peasant revolts as a means of gaining more power for themselves. One of the groups that really loses out, though, due to Tokugawa's stability, is women. Women, in particular, in Tokugawa Japan, see a loss of power as compared to the Edo period, where women have not just been socio-cultural style drivers with regards to art, literature, fashion, and courtly rules, but also the loss of some political and economic power. Inside of the Tokugawa Shogunate, we will see women's roles reduced to that of Confucian filial piety roles, very similar to what we saw in early China. And many of the women who live in Tokugawa Japan will just become basically property for men. Women are not going to have legal standing. They're not going to have economic standing. And women will be seen mainly as objects of sexual desire and as a way of creating more broad family lineage. More sons would be the goal in this case. So for women, we see a retrenchment of their role and a loss of rights overall. So while the Tokugawa Shogunate brings political stability, we can see major issues that will present themselves economically long term as Japan cuts itself off from world trade at the same time that world trade is expanding and bringing more power to regions like Europe. And from a socio-cultural standpoint, we see that while people at the upper spectrum of the socio-economic and socio-cultural pyramid gained more stability and more rights, people at the lower ends, whether they be farmers, artisans, or merchants, or from a strictly social standpoint, women tend to lose out as men and warriors gain more power. To go ahead and summarize much of what we've talked about, go ahead and engage in this application activity. See if you can write a haiku poem about Tokugawa Japan, either basing it around the three unifiers or around some of the major socioeconomic and political policies developed during this time. Until we see you again, bye.